there was not a lot going on. And if you look at the 1860 census, it said the total population of Florida was 140,424 people. Not a lot of people here. 61,745 of those were slaves. White men between the ages of 18 and 45 were roughly 16,000, and 12,000 of those enlisted in the Confederate Army right away, and most of those then were sent out of state. So, I mean, we're getting to the point where there's not a lot of people left in Florida at that point. And down here in southwest Florida, I've read that there were a total of about 7,000 people, and 6,000 of those were divided between Key West and Tampa. So just were not a lot of people here, but there were somewhere between 650 and 700,000 cows. So the next major thing that happens in the great scope of the Civil War, probably even more important than the Battle of Gettysburg, was the Battle of Vicksburg, and Grant captured it in July of 1863, and the significance of that meant that the U.S. Navy controlled the Mississippi River, and the significance of the Navy control of the Mississippi River was the Confederacy could no longer import cattle from what they called the Trans-Mississippi, which were the states like Texas and the other states west of the Mississippi River, so they very rapidly get a significant food shortage going on and are having trouble feeding the troops. And finally somebody says, wait a minute, there's a lot of cows in Florida, let's start eating Florida beef. And so they take our friend James McKay, who was the sutler at Fort Myers. He's in Tampa, he's the mayor of Tampa, and he was really politically connected. He gets himself appointed as head of the Florida Commissary Department. And he contacts his old friends Jacob Summerlin and Captain Hendry. They join the commissary department, and they organize starting cattle drives, shipping the cattle from Central and South Florida up to North Florida in a railhead in Georgia. And then a couple of other things happen is bandits begin to attack these cattle drives, because the Confederate government was paying the cattlemen in Florida $10 in Confederate paper money that really wasn't going to be worth anything unless the South won the Civil War. But the civilian population of the South was badly in need of food too, and a lot of beef smuggling went on where they were sneaking cows. The people that were stealing these cows were sneaking them on up into Georgia and points north, and the civilians were paying up to $150 for a cow to have something to eat. And then there was also a lot of blockade running. The U.S. Navy had a blockade around Florida, and if you could load a ship with cows and get it to Havana, the Spanish were paying 2 ounces in gold for a cow. So if you got one ship through the blockade, you were just a rich man overnight. So, I mean, there was a lot of cattle thievery going on as a result of that. So the Florida Confederate government rapidly organized what they called the cow cavalry, which for the most part were local cattlemen. And so they were, initial role was to guard the shipment of cows. And when the Union realized all these cows are getting shipped out of Florida, they decided they need to do something about that. And to do something they picked is they said, wait a minute, a lot of these cows are down in South Central Florida. We've got a perfectly good fort called Fort Myers down there. We need to reoccupy it. And the first detachment of troops that gets sent here in December of 1863 was the 47th Pennsylvania. And they actually got sent to a lot of different locations around Florida. And the first place they land is on Usapa Island, and for a long time I didn't understand why they landed on Usapa, but then I was reading a Florida history magazine a couple of years ago, and there was actually another old Seminole Indian war fort built on the top of the Indian Mound at Usapa, and the soldiers there actually fought a couple of pitched battles with the Seminole Indians on Usapa Island, which is kind of an obscure point. I never knew that before, but I think it's kind of interesting. And so they spent December on Usapa, and I could just, I like to imagine that these soldiers, after all the horrible carnage going on and all the really bad Civil War battles further north. Here they are on a tropical island and the sunshine and birds and good fishing, and I can just kind of see them stripping down to their boxer shorts and all laying on the beach working on their tans or something, thinking they've really lucked out. But anyway, they in January they move into Fort Myers, and I just found a new book and I'd recommend it to you. It's Wilderness of Destruction, and it's about the Civil War in Florida by a guy named Zach Walters, and he presently lives in Georgia, but the book here says that he actually grew up in Florida and practiced law in Ocala for several years. Okay. But, and he had something new here that I didn't know. Let me find this. Anyway, he said when they were moving into Fort Myers, there was actually some, at least Confederate sympathizers in the remains of the fort at that time, and they actually tried to burn it, and the 47th Pennsylvania ran them off before whatever the remains were of Fort Myers was burned to the ground. I just thought that was something interesting I hadn't seen before. And they, 47th Pennsylvania began to rehabilitate the buildings, and they also built a dirt wall all the way around the fort. And anyway, once the Cal Cavalry people discovered the Union Army has reoccupied Fort Myers, a lot of skirmishes began. The first one was over at Fort Thompson, which is east of LaBelle, and that was another old Seminole Indian War fort. And the Confederates Cal Cavalry occupied that. They ran into the soldiers out of Fort Myers, and they had a brief skirmish where they all shot at each other for a little bit and then rode their separate ways. There was another skirmish like that at Fort Deneau, and then there was a lot of just patrolling in the area and shooting at each other, but really no real casualties. And then the next major event that happens in Florida is in February of 1864. Florida changes its draft law. There had previously been an exemption, a draft exemption for cattlemen, and that was abolished. And so if you were a cattleman in Florida, you had two choices. You could either join the Cal Cavalry, or you could go to Fort Myers and join the Union Army. And that broke up a lot of families. I've looked, and actually there's a lot of Hendrys that came to Fort Myers because they didn't want to become a Confederate soldier, so they came to Fort Myers and became a Union soldier. But that choosing sides, and I've read this from several sources in this book. There was a soldier in Captain Hendry's company called Francis Boggs. He mentions it in his book that there was, at that point when people were choosing sides, there just was a lot of animosity and ill will developing, because if a family decided they were going to move to Fort Myers and become Unionists, generally the Confederates in the area burned their house down and steal their cows because they couldn't take their cows with them. And Boggs just described it as just a very, very bad time. And then I've read further again in this book that when the patrols in Florida, military patrols coming out of Fort Myers, were moving farther north, the colored infantry troops that were here had maintained better military discipline than these volunteers who had decided to become Unionists. They were pretty bitter about having their houses and burned down and their cows stolen. So when they went into, like when they occupied Tampa, they were out looting and burning, and same thing happened when they were at Cedar Key and Brooksville. So, okay, so we've had a change in the draft law, and then the white Union troops in Fort Myers are reinforced by the colored infantry regiment that is sent there. And so when they've got all these extra soldiers, the patrolling really steps up, and they start going farther and farther north. And anyway, but then in March of that year, they go up into the area around Fort Meade and raid the Tillis and the Underhill homesteads. Tillis is killed, they free a lot of slaves, capture a whole bunch of supplies. And then a couple of weeks after that, and I'm glad this mission failed, back in early April, the Union troops out of Fort Myers went into the Fort Meade area with the specific mission of killing James Lanier, killing F.A. Hendry, killing Francis Boggs, killing John Durrance, killing Streety Parker. And fortunately, those group of men were alerted that they were coming and were somewhat prepared. And it turned into a battle called Bowlegs Creek. And again, Waters in his book says that the numbers involved in this battle either went from I gotta look it up here. Give me a minute, please. Let's see. Yeah, here's what he said. He said, numbers in this fight vary from gross exaggeration to pure fantasy. The Confederates claimed they faced 1,000 enemy soldiers. The Union estimated they fought at least 150 Confederates, and the actual numbers were about 75 Union soldiers and 20 Confederate soldiers. But apparently the Confederate soldiers would shoot, then they moved, then they'd shoot again, and kept moving around, so the Union soldiers thought that there were a great many more troops out there than them were there. And apparently James Lanier was killed, but Hendry and the others all survived, so thankfully a lot of us are here because they did survive. So anyway, they had a lot of fighting there around the Fort Meade area. Then in May, they go up and raid Tampa, and as I indicated, I'd read in the book that the volunteers that had been, I guess we'll call them former cattlemen, it said they burned a lot of the buildings in Tampa. Then there's another attack on Fort Meade, and that time the Confederate soldiers in the area did not defend Fort Meade, and it gets burned to the ground. Then the soldiers occupy Cedar Key. Then they attack Brooksville. And I always kind of imagined that the soldiers from Fort Myers must have ridden their horses and marched all the way up to Brooksville, but recently I found out that was actually an amphibious operation. They brought in several schooners and loaded the soldiers and the horses onto the ships, sailed up to the coast until they were kind of parallel with Brooksville and unloaded, and then attacked Brooksville. And there was a militia unit there, and they called it the Old Guard, and it was not called the Old Guard because it had been in existence for so many years. They called it the Old Guard because everybody in it was too old to be in the Army. So I found that amusing. And they put up enough of defense that the Union Army did not actually reach Brooksville, but they burned a swath of plantations about 6 miles long. And one person who actually, after the war, became a resident of Fort Myers was Aaron Taylor Frarson. They burned his plantation up there, and he came down here, intermarried into the Hendry family, and he's buried in our cemetery actually now. But anyway, all of these Union raids were really interfering with the shipment of the cattle, and finally the commanders of the cow cavalry said, we've got to do something about these troops in Fort Myers, and they decide to attack it. That's February the 20th. And again, the numbers get exaggerated. After the battle was over, the Union troops in Fort Myers reported that they had actually been attacked by about 500, and it was maybe about 200 cow cavalry members at most, but, let's see here. Well, let's talk about the actual battle a little bit. And it was several cavalry units from various areas that kind of combined, and they began riding down here. And the original plan was they would cross the river at Fort Thompson. And let's click on this again, Cindy, and move it ahead. I think we've got a picture of Fort Thompson here. Oh, let's stop. Let's back up a minute. Yeah. Hendrix was, and I just kind of liked his appearance when I found him. He was one of the officers of the 47th Pennsylvania. Now let's move it up one more, I think. No, move it back. We gotta go back to.
Where?
Okay, go down. Okay, let's hit it again. Oh, I've lost the picture in there. Go back. Okay. That's a drawing of Fort Myers when the Army occupied it. Okay. See, and these are I'll play with the laser pointer. Okay, these are the officers' quarters, and this is the river right out here, and there's some of the dirt earthworks they built new. So I mean, the fort was really on the edge of the river in those days. And that's out of the National Archives. Okay, let's hit it again, Cindy. Move it ahead. Okay, and there's a picture of some colored infantry troops. Okay, that's what I was looking for. John Bardoff, he was the commander of the colored infantry troops that were stationed here, and he later moved up into the Port Charlotte, Punta Gorda area and became the Postmaster General up there. Okay, let's move it ahead one more. There's a picture of a building at Fort Meade, for whatever that's worth, and then there's a picture of Fort Thompson. And the significance of Fort Thompson during the Indian Wars, okay, is that's where the Caloosahatchee River finally got shallow enough where you could drive cows across it and ride your horse across it. So if you were actually coming to Fort Myers, either to visit Fort Myers or take your cows to Punta Rassa to sell them, you had to go that far east to be able to cross the Caloosahatchee River, and then you'd go back down the south bank to Fort Myers. Anyway, getting back to the Cavalry. They're marching to Fort Myers.
Where is Fort Thompson?
It is east of LaBelle. And there's nothing left there now but a cast iron plaque on the side of the road. And to digress farther this direction toward Lake Okeechobee, there were what they called the rapids or the waterfalls, which made the river at that time impassable to get to Lake Okeechobee. And then sometime in, I want to say the 1890s, a guy named Hamilton Diston dynamited the rapids out of existence so that you could actually take a steamboat from Lake Okeechobee all the way to Fort Myers.
And do you know how far Fort Thompson is east of LaBelle, and in what direction? Is it like out 80?
Yeah, it's right off of 80. That's where the plaque is.
Is it before, what is that?
It's
Pioneer Plantation out there?
I want to say, this sounds real stupid, but it's the best guess I can do tonight. It's before you get to anything else.
Before you get anything else.
It'll give you something to do Saturday morning. You can go look for the Fort Thompson flag.
Okay, thank you, sir.
This spot right here is probably a little bit this way where they call it Lake Flirt. I think that's a wide spot in the river right there.
You're right, yeah.
What's it called?
Lake Flirt,
It was the other lake.
yeah.
Wasn't actually a lake. It was a runoff.
Okay, so let's get back. The cavalry is coming from the Fort Meade area, from the Tampa area, the Ocala area. They're all riding toward Fort Myers. The plan is they're going to cross at Fort Thompson, or right here. They're going to spend the night, and then they're going to make a surprise attack on Fort Myers. But unfortunately, it's February, there's rain squalls, they pretty soon are cold and wet. We had no Southwest Florida Water Management District in those days, so they're riding through 1 or 2 feet of water, and it's just really miserable, and so they end up, and then when they get to the crossing here, instead of being shallow like that where you could ride your horse, it's just a wild roaring river. And so they find some boats and start crossing, and that turns out very badly for them. The boats start capsizing. I've heard the story told that they started with 2 cannons. They lost 1 cannon when a boat turned over, and it's somewhere on the bottom of the Caloosahatchee River right now. They lose a lot of their food. They lose a lot of their ammunition. Just, you know, they were not having a good time at that point. And so they end up staying at Fort Thompson and getting dried out, and that changes the timing so that they can't make a night attack on Fort Myers, and so they're riding in the daytime down toward the fort, and they begin to get closer to Fort Myers. First thing they encounter are some cows that are being herded by 3 Union soldiers. They ask them to surrender. 2 of them do. The 3rd one starts to run back to the fort. He's killed, and as far as I can really determine, he was probably the only casualty of the battle. And then they continue on. They get to Billy's Creek. There's a guard post at Billy's Creek, and they do kind of a mini cavalry charge on it and capture the soldiers at the guard post there on Billy's Creek before they can fire a shot. And so then they're getting closer to Fort Myers, and the original plan was they were just going to do a charge and then attack the fort at that point, but then Major Footman announces he's going to send a soldier under a white flag and ask the fort to surrender. And I always wondered for years why he did that. And then somewhere I acquired a news press article from 1926 where the news press interviewed a former Confederate soldier named John Pasteur from the Ocala Company, and he tells the news press that he was actually the soldier that went in with the white flag, and the reason why Major Footman did that instead of the surprise attack was because Footman had been advised that the fort was not only full of soldiers, it was full of women and children, who were the wives and the children of the volunteers that decided they didn't want to be Confederates and came down to Fort Myers and enlisted. And so that's why Major Footman was going to offer them the opportunity to go ahead and surrender. And then Pasteur says this is kind of funny. When he got to the gate of the fort, there was just 1 white soldier, 1 black soldier there, and they said, hey, you know, we're only privates, we got to go find an officer. And so that took a little bit of time, and he asked these 2 soldiers, where is everybody? And he says, oh, they're over at the riverbank fishing. So, but anyway, they finally scare up an officer who tells, you know, the fishing reports I've said, the officer says, no, you know, we're not going to surrender, we're going to defend this fort to the death, et cetera, et cetera. But according to Pasteur, he said what the officer told him, if you've more men than I have, crack your whip. So anyway, Pasteur then rides back, finds Major Footman. Major Footman's out there with the cannon loaded, and as soon as he said they're not going to surrender, they fire the cannon. And then again, according to Pasteur, and I haven't found this in any of the other accounts, the cannonball goes over the wall and it hits one of the buildings inside the fort. And at that point, he said you could hear all the women and the children in the fort. You know, could hear the glass breaking and the women screaming and the children crying. And anyway, at that point, the battle is on, and according to reports, the Union had 1 little cannon, or possibly 2, the stories vary, and they rolled that out through the gate and set it up outside the fort, and a number of soldiers came out, and they start shooting at the Confederates. The cavalry is shooting back from about 1,000 yards away, and this goes on all day, and at that point, both sides kind of have a council of war, and the Confederate troops, at least this is my dad's version, said one, they killed a cow and had a steak dinner, and then they talked, and they decided that they needed to all go home, Because they kind of said, well, look, we've shelled the fort all day, nothing has happened. The U.S. Navy is down at Punta Rassa, and if they decide to send a gunboat up the river to see what all this shooting's about, we're gonna be trapped down here. And so they make their way back to Fort Thompson, cross the river again. That takes a while, kill some more cows and have another steak dinner that evening, and then head on back home. And then Pasteur in his account, but remember this is 1926 and the battle was in 1865. He said, Pasteur in his recollection said the Union soldiers in the fort left the next day. Actually, it was about 2 weeks later. Because apparently the Union soldiers, when they were asked why didn't they pursue the retreating Confederate soldiers, I said, well, there's at least 500 of them. We have only a couple hundred here. We just can't do that. And then also accordingly they left because they had said, hey, if they come back and there's more of them, you know, they could come over the wall the next time. We need to get down to Punta Rassa where the Navy can protect us. And so, and the Union reports also said they found bandages and things that apparently evidence that maybe 30 or 40 of the Confederate soldiers had at least been wounded or killed, but none of the Confederate accounts say that at all. Apparently none of the Confederate soldiers were really injured at all. And so that's the Battle of Fort Mars, and that happened in February. And in kind of an unexpected or unintended consequence, then in March the 6th was the Battle of Natural Bridge, because the Union High Command in Florida said, wait a minute, if there's 500 Confederates and they're all down around Fort Mars, that's every single Confederate soldier in the state of Florida at this point. So they decided that would be a good time to attack Tallahassee. And so I've heard it referred to as the Battle of Fort St. Marks or the Battle of Natural Bridge, but they mounted an expedition heading toward Tallahassee, and they were met by a lot of volunteers, the Cadet Corps of what now is the Florida State College for Women, a few regular Confederate Army units were there, and they were able to stop the the Union attempt to capture Tallahassee. And for whatever significance it is, Tallahassee was the only Union capital that had not been captured by the end of the Civil War. Although apparently, I think I remember reading that the governor at the time then committed suicide when he found out that the war was lost. And then, so that was, attack on Fort Mars was February, attack on Tallahassee was March, and then in April, Lee surrenders. Rapidly, the Confederate cabinet and Jefferson Davis is captured, and the war is over. And I've read several articles about the Cal Cavalry. A number of them are written by a cousin of mine who's now passed away, named Kyle Van Landingham. And anyway, his conclusion and some of the other authors he was working with was that really the Cal Cavalry was not dedicated Confederates, but joining the Cal Cavalry was the best way to keep your herds together, so as soon as the war was over, they could go back to selling them to Cuba. So
strategy.
And then once the trade with Cuba resumed, which probably ran until 1898, the Spanish-American War, is the Cuban cattle buyers were paying in gold, and all that wealth flowed into Fort Mars, and the cattlemen suddenly found they were owning businesses and putting up all those brick buildings down there and starting banks, and that's why we've got the beautiful downtown we've got now, is really, the sort of the residue or remainder of the cattle trade with Cuba. And I've also read that the banks downtown, they would accept the Confederate, the Cuban gold coins just as readily as they did U.S. currency. So I'm sort of done at this point. Does anybody have any questions or tell their own family stories or what? Go ahead, Tom.
Hey, do you have any idea how long it took them to take the cavalry from Fort Meade to Fort Myers?
I think probably a couple of days would be my best guess. Although that's kind of an interesting thing I've encountered before. I mean, like, Jacob Summerlin's real home was in Bartow, although he had cattle herds down there, and these guys in the cattle business, and I guess probably a lot of others, they thought nothing of setting out on their horse to go to Tampa or go up to Fort Meade.
The problem is figure about 10, 12 miles a day would be very.
I gotta go get Steven. Wait a minute. Steven's supposed to give us a certificate from Hendry.
And I've got a couple of things here you're welcome to come up and look at after this is over, because I didn't make it onto the PowerPoint at the time.
Thank you for the question.
I had a question on the map with, in the second and third Seminole Wars, you had, it's way back at the beginning, you had a row of 6 forts, and it showed that 3 were for the second Seminole and 3 were for the third Seminole. And I couldn't tell if they were duplicates or if there's 6 individual forts in a row.
Let's,
Way back.
Cindy, let's get back to that, please.
It's a few more back now.
There we go.
I see 3 green and 3 red, and I didn't know if those are
Let's
6 individual
see.
forts along the
It,
three.
it says green is military forts,
You want the other half to see? I'm okay.
and those were Second Seminole Indian War forts, and then the purple are the Third Seminole Indian War forts. But, the
I
Army,
can only think of 4 named forts, so I just didn't know if there's 2 additional ones.
well, there was a lot of forts, and, during these wars, and the Army tended to build forts along the rivers, kind of as a barricade, because if you, I mean, when you're going up, north, I mean, there's Fort Ogden, a number of forts up there, kind of along that corridor, and then they had these forts here. You had Fort Deneau, let me slow myself down, Fort Delaney down here at the mouth of the river, and then at Fort Myers, it was Fort Harvey during the Second Seminole Indian War, and then when they rebuilt it, it became Fort Myers. Then you had, let me think, and this was Fort Deneau, this was Fort Thompson, and then there were more forts down in here, and then over here you had Fort Pierce, Fort Lauderdale. Because a whole lot of Florida cities now were originally armor forts, but they, you know, like the Caloosahatchee, they built a whole row of forts along there to kind of stop the Indians from crossing the Caloosahatchee and heading further north. And there's the hills up at Tampa. There's the Hillsborough River State Park, and they have rebuilt that fort there. And it's not open all the time, but it's open sometimes. But it's interesting to visit. And the reason why that fort was built there is the Seminoles had a bad habit of burning bridges, because the Army always traveled with a lot of supply wagons and ox carts. They traveled pretty heavy, and so whenever they got to a river where the Seminoles would just wade across it, Army had to build a bridge, and so the Army would build a bridge across it, and as soon as they passed on by, Seminoles would come in and burn the bridge. So the Army had to build a lot, sometimes permanent forts and sometimes just temporary forts to protect the bridges. So Florida is covered with a lot of either forts or areas where forts used to be. But anyway, these pictures did not make the PowerPoint. But this allegedly is the house that Winfield, you can come up and look at it after, the house that Winfield Scott Hancock lived in on the row of the officers' quarters, and it was originally built right where what I still call the old post office, but it's the Vernon Sidney Davis Art Center. This house originally sat there, and a whole bunch of early settlers in Fort Myers owned it, and then Harvey Heitman bought it, and he had it moved down to Bay Street and was going to build a hotel on the site where the post office building is, and then the Depression hit, hotel didn't get built, and the post office got built there as a WPA project. But this was down on Bay Street, and it became the city library until about the 1930s, and then it was in such poor repair that it got torn down. And then another house that lasted a fairly long time was William Marion Hendry's house, and it was also located down on Bay Street. And I've heard sort of two different stories on that. One, that it was an officer's house, or at least a structure in the fort, and then the other variation is that William Marion Hendry built it out of wood he had salvaged from the fort. But I don't know how long this house lasted before it was torn down, but it looks like 1930s cars in the picture, so it at least had survived that long. And then I also brought, I might need to add this to the PowerPoint. This is the roster of Captain Hendry's cavalry company, and you're all are welcome. Anybody who wants to come up and look at it. And it's amazing how many old family names are on this list that are still in this area, and a lot of them are still in the cattle business. Oh, and that's a better picture. Thank you, Cindy. Even though you did that by accident.
I did.
That's the Hancock House in its glory when it was in fairly good repair. But anyway, just looking at some of these names, you had Francis Hendry as the captain, then Boggs as the lieutenant, second lieutenant was a John Fuel, they're around, third lieutenant George Hendry, and then going through the list of the enlisted men, there's Altmans, there's Blunts, Carneys, Chandlers, Currys, Durances, Flints, more Hendry, Hollingsworths, Parkers, Pierces, Prescott, Prine, Rainey, Saps, Skipper. Last time I gave this talk here, Skipper's great-grandson was here. Then Summerlands, Jacob and Jasper, Willoughby Tillis, Wilson's related to the Hendrys by marriage. Then you've got Zippers. The Wiggins. But it's just interesting to me. I mean, how many of these people are still in the area? A lot of them are still in the cattle business, and how a lot of these families were related to each other by marriage. Were related to the Hendrys, were related to the Wilson family up in the Bartow and Sarasota area. Were related to the Parkers up in the Punta Gorda. The Bartow area. It's just.
Well,
Okay,
hey,
come on up here.
on behalf of the Board of Directors of the Southwest Florida Historical Society, we thank you for your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it. They say lawyers and preachers, they, cannot pass up an opportunity to speak to any group of more than about 2 people. That's wise to me. So I enjoy being here, and if anybody has any questions, I'll at least make up an answer if I don't know. And look at the pictures and look at the roster, that's fine too. But thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Hank.